I'm going to talk to you about the landscape of the Lost Peatland project area. And it's going to be quite a personal sort of perspective on it, so there's not going to be many photographs of animals. That's really what that means. If you know me, you understand what that's all about. So there we are, that's the title. Move it forward swiftly. So there's a very simple equation that you could use to describe what landscapes are. A landscape is really made up of geology, vegetation, and water. And our role in all that, us, is really important. It's really important to understand how we figure into all of that. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I suppose you could argue that I should have said wild animals or something in that equation as well, but in terms of the whole picture, although they are significant, of course, past and present, wild and domesticated, animals have played really quite important parts in moulding our landscape, but not as important as vegetation, geology and water. So that's why they are the main part of that equation. Okay, so you'll have seen many slides like this already, showing you where the Lost Peatland area is. You're all fairly familiar with it. Geologically, it's fairly straightforward. It's right smack in the middle of the South Wales coalfield. So the dominant geology is coal measures and Pennant sandstone. The outcrops that we see, fabulous scarps that Richard talked about earlier, they're all made up of Pennant sandstone. And so it's a relatively simple geology to think about. As far as topography is concerned, again, as Richard said, we're dealing here with a fairly high plateau in South Wales, either some of the highest grounds in South Wales, which rise up to somewhere in the region of 2,000 feet, 600 metres in metric systems, which is very high for this part of the world. And that has an extreme influence on the vegetation that can grow there, the animals that can be there, and of course on the climate, which Scott talked about a few minutes ago. So the topography is really, really a crucial part of the landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the historical landscape of the Lost Peatlands area, and then sort of drive forward and talk a little bit more about some of the things that I think are significant and that I contributed to in this project and in elsewhere. And that's why I said originally it's more of a personal account than a sort of general one. The post-glacial landscape of the Lost Peatlands area, if we went back about 20 to 30,000 years ago, it would have been completely covered by ice. In fact, where we are sitting and standing right now would have been completely covered with ice. The Devensian Ice Age, as it was called, as we call it, was a pretty severe ice age. And this part of South Wales was severely glaciated, so there was wall-to-wall ice everywhere. And then as we move towards the end of that ice age, despite a few hiccups, we head towards a time when the landscape would have looked perhaps a little bit like this. This is a typical sort of periglacial landscape where there are still glaciers, as you can see there. But at the edge of the glaciers, particularly in the summertime, when the snow is melted, it sort of unveils a vegetation which is made up mostly of grasses and sedges. It's a treeless landscape. It's completely treeless. And this is what our landscape, our Lost Peatlands landscape would have looked like, let's say 10,000, 12,000 years ago. And even as the ice was melting, we would have been left with a treeless landscape that looked like this. In summer, this is the Cairngorms in Scotland, but our landscape would have looked exactly like this 10,000 years ago, a completely treeless landscape. But of course, what happens is that the climate continually ameliorates. It gets better and better. It sort of gets warmer. There are still seasons, there are still cold winters, but there are now summers which allow plants to grow. But more importantly than that, trees and other woody things that sort of disappeared from our landscape during the Ice Age and which took refuge in southern Europe and parts of Eastern Europe, and maybe in Asia, now we're gradually moving across in the wake of the melting ice, and they began to reinvade our countryside. So we move from a time where the vegetation is dominated by grasses and sedges, as you can see there in the top left, with some really colourful flora like this mountain avens that we see here. So that's Bigelow sedge up there in the top left, and this is mountain avens. And they would have been common in the periglacial and tundra landscape shortly after the Ice Age, in terms of a couple of thousand years. But gradually, they would have disappeared. In fact, neither of these two species are now anywhere in our post-glacial landscape, even though we do have some remnants of that time, which I'll talk about a little bit later. As the ice melts, of course, we get the formation of beautiful lakes. And gradually, as you can see, this is Craig Llyn, and this is Llyn Fach, the lake. It's well known to most of us. And gradually, we would have seen something like this. The lakes would have become more prominent as the ice melted, as I said. But also, the scarps around us and the ground around us gradually would have become populated, speckled with trees and bushes here and there. And these trees and bushes would have been things like juniper, birch, aspen maybe, perhaps some hazel as well. Hazel arrived fairly early in the colonization process. But above all, pine. Pine was going to make a very, very big part in this story. And so eventually, our landscape would have been completely dominated by pine forests. Now, this is a photograph of part of the Caledonian pine forest in Scotland. And these are native Scots pines, the only place in Britain where we have now native Scots pines. But at the time I'm talking about, a few thousand years after the end of the Ice Age, pine and pine forests like this would have been everywhere in our landscape and would have dominated it. And of course, it's no longer there at all. There is pine in our landscape, as I'll mention later on, and it is Scots pine, but it's not that Scots pine. It's a Scots pine that's been derived from European stock and which has been planted in plantations in South Wales. Nevertheless, that is and can be quite significant. I'll tell you more about that later. So these pine forests are absolutely wonderful. And if you ever have a chance to go to parts of the Highlands of Western Scotland and get into some of these Caledonian pine forests, I thoroughly recommend it. They are magic places. So they're full of huge hummocks of juniper, all sorts of things like wintergreens and cowberry and crowberry and bilberry everywhere, heathers. It's an absolutely wonderful landscape. And that's what we would have had at this time, about 2,000 years after the end of the Ice Age. And then what would have happened was that the pine would have retreated ever more northwards and would gradually have been replaced by deciduous woodland. And what we can see here is sort of cover of sessile oak. And this is a photograph from a local area, not very far actually from where we're standing right now. But if we believe what ecologists tell us, then almost everywhere from Land's End to John O'Groats would have had deciduous forest in them, amongst pine forests as well in the far north. And the story was that a squirrel, you could jump on a tree in Land's End and go all the way in the canopy to John O'Groats without touching the ground. Such was the cover of deciduous woodland at that time. That may be a bit of an over-exaggeration, but it gives you some picture of the extent of deciduous woodland there was at this period of time. We're talking almost sort of like 80 to 100% cover of woodland in Britain. It's phenomenal when you think about it. And this defines what Oliver Rackham called the wildwood, when he talked about Britain's wildwood and our ancient woodlands of today, which are derived from that wildwood. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about these Atlantic forests that were in our landscape at that period of time. And they were wonderful places, and they weren't necessarily sort of thick with trees like some of our conifer forests are. They would have had really open, airy sorts of places in them. And really importantly, at least for me, is the amount of lichen cover there must have been at that time. And we're seeing something of a resurgence of this in our landscape right now, which I'll talk about a bit later. So trees would have been completely draped with lungwort lichens like you have here, okay? On the far left, that's Loberia pulmonaria, the famous lungwort. But these are two other lungworts here. You've got Loberia virens, which is the green one, and then Loberia scrobulata, the one above it, often called lob scrob by those people who know it and love it so much. So our Atlantic woodlands at that period of time would have been smothered in mosses and lichens like this. Keep that in mind. But of course, while all of this is happening, human beings are having more and more of an effect on the landscape. Their populations are growing, and they demand more from their environment. And we cross over very significantly from the earlier Mesolithic cultures towards a Neolithic culture, a culture of incredibly clever people who smelted metal for the first time. They invented farming. But to do all of these things and to, if you like, support their ever-growing sort of little settlements and populations, they needed to cut trees down, and that's what they did. And it's quite staggering, actually, how much they did in terms of forest clearance at that time. So views like this would have been sort of pretty common in the landscape that we're talking about today, where you'd have a grassy, sort of largely grassy area with ferns like bracken present, and the remnants of the woodland that was there before, the deciduous woodland that was there before, hugging these sort of little valleys like this. That's what it would have looked like. And of course, these cultures grew and grew and grew, and populations expanded and expanded and expanded. Their needs became greater and greater and greater. More and more forests were felled as a result of that. And eventually, we end up with a landscape in our uplands which looks very similar, with one exception, which I'll come to later, to the landscape that we have today. It would have been dominated by things like purple moorgrass, heathers, and all the sorts of things that come with these heathland and moorland type communities. And the climate at this time would have been very, very wet, perhaps even wetter than we are experiencing today. We would have had very, very wet, very mild winters, followed by summers which were much warmer than the winters and were also extremely wet. It was almost like, an even tropical or mesotropical climate. And under that influence, we would have had huge amounts of boggy areas developing, which of course is the subject of the Lost Peatlands project area. So this is where our peatlands come from. They come mostly from this period of time. And the fact that they could develop is the result of lots of things. The climate, the extreme wet climate, which was not conducive to forest growth, and also the fact that human beings were clearing these areas for one reason or another as well. Now, you may recognize this, and perhaps you don't. This is a photograph of the flow country, the Forcenard flows in Sutherland. This, in my opinion, is the only area of true wilderness in the whole of Britain. And much of our landscape would have looked like this at one time or other. And that is the basis of the project that we're talking about today. Okay, how do we know all of this? I'm going to do this very, very quickly. Well, we can do it mainly because we have fossil evidence which comes from pollen deposits. Top left hand there, that's a photograph of some pollen grains. It's a stunning scanning electron microscope picture of pollen grains. And if you have, let's say, a lake area or a peaty area such as that depicted here, which is surrounded by vegetation, And particularly if that vegetation is wind pollinated, which is what most of our trees are, and all of our grasses and all of our sedges, then what happens is that the massive amounts of pollen that those plants produce forms a pollen rain, and that is deposited into these lakes or into these bogs or whatever. Now, the little yellow pollen grains, it's not the scale, obviously, but the little yellow things at the base of the trough there, they represent pollen that came from grasses and sedges before those trees were present. So that represents what happens shortly after the ice had melted. But those grass and sedge communities were replaced by trees, and so trees produce pollen, and you can see the black pollen represents tree pollen coming from that. The point here, the important point, is that the different forms of pollen sort of rain into that trough and form layers one on top of each other. And of course, the order of the pollen in those layers gives us the sort of lineage, the time lineage, of the changes that took place in that landscape. And that's basically what underlies this sort of science. So we've got areas like this in our landscape where we can bore down into the peat and pull up a long column of peat, such as depicted here. And if it's a really good selection, a really deep deposit, then we could possibly make out all of these changes in chronological order from the bottom to the top, based on microfossil and to some extent macrofossil and archaeological evidence as well, coupled with radiocarbon dating and all the other things that science has given us. So that's absolutely fantastic. And we can trace then the changes that have taken place in the landscape from tundra through the pine woods, the deciduous woods, the arrival of Neolithic farming, the Bronze Age, the Celtic cultures, the Romans, the Anglo-Normans, the Tudor clearances, and so on, all the way up to modern industrial times. We can actually figure that out. And that's the evidence that we have, which tells us that these things have happened. And such peat boring exercises have taken place all over the country, particularly in England, Wales, and Scotland. Well, that is the country, isn't it? So, and what we get is a picture that looks like this. I don't want to spend too much time on it because, technically it's quite difficult to understand at first glance. But basically, the black areas represent, the area of the black areas represents the actual abundance of the certain species that you're looking at. So, right smack in the middle, you've got something which is labelled pinus. Pinus is the generic name for pine. And you can see that down the chronology is early times at the bottom, where we have park tundra, all the way up to modern times at the top. So right at the bottom, there are no trees. The pollen analysis just gives us things like grasses and sedges. And then pine arrives, and so you have massive pine spikes. And then that disappears, and as that disappears, the deciduous trees take the place. So you've got alder and oak and elm coming in. And then towards the top of the diagram, which is also very significant, you can see that trees are now, forming less proportion of the pollen in the sample because they're being cut down, and grasses are now making a really big sort of picture in all of this, and that's because the trees are being replaced by grassy lands. So that's what pollen diagrams tell us. And this is what you would call a general pollen diagram for the whole of the country. A good question would be, do we have any evidence of such things in our location? You bet you we do. If you were to drive from Tirwedd to Tirwedd over the famous Rigos Road, on your right-hand side at the top is the area where such a peat bore was taken, I think in the 1950s, correct me if I'm wrong. And without going into exact details, it's not a very deep core, but it does give us the same sort of picture. The early arrival of pine, the disappearance of pine being replaced by deciduous forests. So we have really good evidence that this is what happened in post-glacial times. We know a lot about historic changes in our landscape. So to sum up then the post-glacial history, we've got the end of the last ice age, which is about 12,000 years ago. And then we've got what we call the pre-boreal period, 10,000 years ago, where juniper, pine and birch become dominant. And that is replaced by the boreal period, where pine is replaced by hazel, oak and elm. Hazel is incredibly important in the history of our vegetation. And then we go into an Atlantic period, the period of the wildwood that Oliver Rackham talks about. 5,000 years ago, this is when human influences become very, very important. What I always used to say to students was that for Mesolithic people, they belong to the land, but for Neolithic people, the land belonged to them. And that was a subtle cultural change in human history. You know, the fact that now the land was something that could be dominated had a huge, huge influence on what happened to the land after that. Okay, and then the sub-Atlantic period, which is more or less what we're in now, brings us right up to date. Massive forest clearance. So, and that's punctuated by all of these changes. Increasing influence by people, Neolithic, Bronze Age, Celtic people, the Romans, the Normans, the Middle Ages, and so on. That's the history that punctuates all of this that has happened in the sub-Atlantic period. Okay, so, all right, we're left then with a landscape. And what is a good question to ask is, how much of that landscape that we're left with are we inherited from that period of time? Because that's important. This is part of our culture. You know, people like to know these things, I think. So first of all, and Richard put this very eloquently, we have this wonderful scarp, which is actually just outside the Lost Peatlands area, but you know, it's sort of, we include it as part of this beautiful landscape. This wonderful north-facing scarp, Craigerllyn, where there are still remnants of the tundra vegetation that occurred in this area 8 to 10,000 years ago. Okay, so we've got roseroot there in the bottom picture, the picture on the right, growing all over the rocky sandstone outcrops of Craigerllyn. And that is an Arctic alpine species, which is a remnant of that Arctic alpine vegetation that occurred all those thousands of years ago. So that's really important. We don't have any native pine forests. They're only, in Britain, they only occur in Scotland, as I said earlier on. But we do have planted pine forests. They are Scots pine forests. Of course, yes, they're totally artificial. They're totally alien in that sense. But they do give us a feel for what it must have been like. And in some ways, the word that ecologists use is their physiognomy, their structure, is really very similar to what the native pine forest would have looked like in the early days. There are lots of species missing, but the overall structure and feel of that habitat is still very similar. And what is totally fantastic, and you don't see this in textbooks, right? What is totally fantastic is in some of these pine forests, which have now been growing for 80 plus years, something wonderful is happening. There is now a sub-canopy growing under them, which is made up of sessile oak, birch, rowan, and holly. And those species are the native species of our native sessile oak woodlands. And so what we're seeing in these pine forests is exactly what would have happened in the transition between the boreal period and the Atlantic period. And it's such a fantastic educational resource that you could actually show students, this is what happened. You know, it's there for you to look at. This is how it happened. It's totally wonderful. And all of these forests should be protected. They shouldn't be felled. They should be totally protected. Just my opinion. And still, of course, we've got loads of Molinia grassland everywhere, which reminds us what much of our landscape looked like for thousands of years. You know, after the Romans, and from there onwards, our landscape was totally dominated by Molinia grassland like this, and peat bogs and dwarf shrub heath, those sorts of things. So that's some of the stuff that we've inherited from the past. But on top of all that, there are habitats that we've created as well. And this is where sort of many people think that my opinions are slightly off kilter, because I've talked so much over the last 15 years about how good conifer plantations are. But I'm going to say it again here as well. If you were to go almost anywhere in Rhondda Cynon Taf or in Neath Talbot, in the upland plateau, you're going to see something like this. You're going to see wind farms, and you're going to see conifers, lots of them. And that's because Rhondda Cynon Taf and Neath Talbot have a lot of conifer forests. And we have put them there. And I want you to take heed of this, because this is also something you don't see in textbooks. On the left-hand side there is the transitions that I talked about earlier on, the post-glacial changes that took place in our landscape from tundra through to pine, through to Atlantic, temperate rainforests, through to modern times where our landscape has been dominated by moorlands. We're looking at a timescale which is over thousands of years. Thousands of years those changes took place. If you rushed up to 1960, I guess, when conifer plantations sort of started to happen more or less around about 1920 in Wales and elsewhere in the country. But it really wasn't until after the war, 1950s, 1960s, that they were really planted in earnest in our landscape. So if you went back to about 1960, before all those plantations were put there, you'd still be seeing a moorland landscape in the Lost Peatland area that looked like the top photographs there. And then, within a period of 60 years since that, the landscape now looks like this. Guys, this is the biggest landscape change that has ever occurred in this country. It is incredibly significant how much people changed our landscape. It is totally incredible. And so if you look at an aerial photograph of the area, what you see now, you don't see blanket green coloration, which is the result of, massive amounts of Molinia and dwarf shrub heath and so on. You see that is there, but now what is also there are these very, very dark areas, and all of those dark areas are conifer forests. So that's how much we've changed that landscape. And within this landscape, as this map shows, we've got very significant areas of deep peat, which this wonderful project has been all about. Places like this, which is Black Bog, which is above Glencorrwg. So one of the things that have really interested me, and I've written about quite a bit in recent years, is the habitat remnants that occur in these places. These are relics of a much bigger ecosystem that occurred in the past. And there's also a new biodiversity here which is associated with our conifer forests that we need to take heed of. That not everything about conifer forests and conifer plantations is bad. The first thing is this. This is a north-facing bank along a forest road near Pennycummaeth, not very far from the hub of Pennycummaeth. And this is fairly typical dwarf shrub heath. And this sort of vegetation would have been wall to wall up here in the past before the conifer forest was planted. And it's fantastic. It's the sort of place where you can see bilberry bumblebees and all sorts of lovely things like that. But those of you who know me would know that I never give a presentation without a photograph of a club moss in it. Okay? So these areas are where 3 species of club moss can be found. Top photograph on the left, that's Stag's Horn club moss. On the left, that's Hupersia silago, which is fir club moss. And this lovely thing here on the right is alpine club moss. All 3 of these club mosses grow in the Lost Peatlands area in dwarf shrub heath habitats at the edges of forest roads. And they can only prosper there because they're at the edge of forest roads. Yeah? So this is really, really important. And also we've got these wonderful grassy verges that occur along these forest roads as well. And, you know, I could go on, I could give a whole talk on the flora of these grassy verges. But what lots of people will want to see is all the orchids that grow there. It'll blow your mind. You walk through along some of these verges along these forests, and the orchids you see will blow your mind. It's incredible. So it's not uncommon to see bee orchids and pyramidal orchids in these places. It's not uncommon to see common spotted orchid, top left there. It's not uncommon to see broadleaf hellebrine, which is sort of the biggest photograph towards the right. Marsh, common marsh orchid, southern marsh orchid, and twayblades. They are all in these grassy verges along these forest roads in our Lost Peatlands area. And incredibly, areas which I know Richard will be as familiar with as I am, areas along these roads where, because the roads are dressed with limestone chip bins, you've got a calcicole type vegetation developing, where you're going to see lots of wild thyme. One of the few places in the whole of our landscape where wild thyme grows. We used to see it on the coasts, but not in these uplands, but it's there in plenty in some places. And perhaps the greatest thing of all in this vegetation, and right on the dividing line between Neathport Talbot and Ronald Cunnintaff, it's almost as if it can't make up its mind which county to be in, so it's going to be in both. We have this fantastic population of autumn gentians, which people go to photograph because it's so special. You know, these are wonderful things. Okay, lastly, this is gobsmacking, totally gobsmacking. I'm famous for my hyperbole, by the way, so you have to bear that in mind. The re-emergence of the Atlantic temperate rainforest. So we all know about that now. This is so sexy these days, isn't it, to talk about the temperate rainforest and the Celtic rainforest. It's given all sorts of wonderful names. And we're given to think that, you know, it's somewhere else. It's somewhere maybe in North Wales. It's certainly along parts of northern England, the western coast of northern England, and predominantly along the west coast of Scotland. But guys, it's right here. We have it right here. And it's developing in our Lost Peatland area. This is amazing. This is a bank that had larch growing on it. Because of the larch disease, it was clear fell maybe 10 years ago or more. Within 4 years, it was being populated, these little shrubs. That is sessile oak. So some jays have been really busy picking up acorns and burying them in this ground here. This is going to be a sessile oak woodland. It's going to look like that. And sooner than you think, it's going to look like that. And the potential for temperate rainforests in our area don't look any further than the edges of some of our conifer forests, where you have masses of mosses and ferns as well, polypody ferns in particular, which drape the trees. Look at this larch tree on the top here. It's absolutely smothered in plate moss, hypnum andoi. You'd never think that was on our doorstep. But it's huge amounts of communities that look like this. Yeah? Isothecium Mawndiroides in huge clumps everywhere in these places. These are Atlantic forest indicators. But this is absolutely incredible. On the left-hand side there, that's called fingered cowwort. It's a tiny liverwort, right? Calura caliprifolia. Its scientific name is much prettier than its English name. And on the right-hand side there is Irish Daltonia, Daltonia splachnoides. They were both totally unheard of in our landscape 50 years ago. Totally unheard of. But because of conifer forests, and because of the change in our climate, because our climate is getting wetter and more Atlantic-like, more oceanic, then spores from Ireland, which have been driven across the Irish Sea in westerly winds, have carried these species to these places. Now, that was probably always happening, but now they can find a home here because the climate really suits them. They're called hyper-oceanic species. That means that they don't just like oceanic conditions, they like real proper oceanic conditions. Now, my wife specialised in finding Corolla calyprifolia. You wouldn't believe the distribution of this species in Rhondda Cynon Taf and East Petawa today. It's absolutely incredible. And it's an indicator of a change that is taking place in front of us right now, the development of a proper Atlantic Celtic rainforest on our doorsteps. But there's more. These are Atlantic lichens, which are in our area as well. On the left-hand side, that's called Sticta limbata, a really rare lichen in Wales, a truly oceanic Atlantic lichen. And there's another Sticta on the bottom right there, that's Sticta ferruginosa. And above it, perhaps the most incredible thing of all, that's Paneria rubiginosa. Think in Glencorrwg, which is in our project area, this is possibly the only site for this species in Wales right now. If you went to the Atlantic Forest of Scotland, you would see it there. As I said, guys, these things are happening in front of us. And I think it was Scott and maybe Richard as well both said, you know, it's just for the want of looking for these things, which is what this project has been about, isn't it? Looking for things and finding things, training people, and all that sort of thing. That's why it's such a great project. And this, you know, if you ever wanted an example of what reversing the trends is all about, here it is. This is the interior of a Sitka spruce forest in bulk, the bulk forest area. In fact, the Sitka spruce has recently been completely felled there. But this was taken maybe, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago. What you see there is a trench. Now, when these forests were planted, trenches were built in order to drain the swamp, so to speak. So water needed to be drained out of these forests in order to give the Sitka, you know, a better chance to get started and grow. But nature wasn't having any of that, okay? These trenches became completely full of bryophytes, sphagnum species, liverworts like Diplophyllum albicans, and many, many others filled up these trenches. It's absolutely amazing when you see it. And they said, these bryophytes said, no bloody way are you letting water disappear from this site. We are keeping this water. That's one of the greatest ecological services that the peatlands give us, keeping water. Was it Richard or was it Scott who said, that's why we're getting floods? It's because water that should be kept up there is coming down the valleys and flooding the lands below it. So it's a living example, a natural example of what the Lost Peatlands is doing. And it does work, guys. It really does work. There's the evidence for you. Okay. Ooh, well, that's weird. Okay, anyway. Right, so indulge me a little bit here. I often go to this place, and I'm not sure why it's become greyed out in the middle there. I often go to this place and sit on this side and look out sort of roughly northeastwards towards Van Neer. I don't know if you know Van Neer. Van Neer sits between sort of Van Gehelig and Van Vawr, I think, yeah. And Van Neer is the mother of the Neath Valley, okay? It's where lots of head streams begin, which eventually go into the Neath Fechan, which in the vicinity of Pont Neath Fechan flow into the Mellor River and then become the Neath Valley, basically. So it's a wonderful mountain. It's one of my most favourite mountains. So I sit there and I reflect, looking there, you know, that's how sad I am. So looking out in there, I can't help thinking about what the author Barry Lopez always goes on about in his books. Now, there's an American magazine called Outdoors, which is a really famous among people who like walking and hiking and mountaineering. And many years ago, they had a list of what they thought was the 10 most important books that everybody who's interested in going outside should read. And Barry Lopez's Arctic Dreams was almost at the top of that list. It's a fabulous read. And what Barry Lopez does in his books is he shows you that human beings are intricately linked with their landscape. Some of them don't know it. And some of them don't have a chance to know it. That's the most impoverishing thing of all. Many of us are lucky in the sense that we're able to get out into it. And many people are captured, imprisoned in places where they can't see natural landscapes. And that's something we really need to think about in the future. So we are entangled with our landscape. And there's a word which many of you will know, I'm sure. If you did Welsh at school like I did, I'm not a Welsh speaker, but all children of my age, not my age, then, when I was a child, had to do Welsh. And I can remember my Welsh teacher saying to me, here's a lovely word, hiraeth. And he used to say, well, it's not translatable, really. It's only got a Welsh meaning. I don't think that's true. Hiraeth is difficult to translate using the English language, but why do that? Just say hiraeth in the English language. Hiraeth is hiraeth, you know what I mean? You don't have to have an English translation. It's all about a longing for a landscape that you belong in. It's all about being embedded in your landscape. That is so important to know and understand. We are embedded in our landscape. And you know, it's where we live. That's the really crucial thing about it. It's our home outside of our homes. It's where we live. It's so important to us. So it has given us our culture. And as somebody else had mentioned earlier, I think Becky, it also gives us this fabulous thing which we now call well-being. It really does work. How often do doctors say, instead of taking this pill, why don't you just go for a walk every afternoon? Do you know what I mean? Get out there and let the landscape sort of come to you. So our landscape also, of course, provides us with wild places, and it's a crucial sort of ecological service, ecosystem service, as I said earlier, not just for flooding, but for wildfires, as Scott was telling us. So these are all really important. And this, I can't speak highly enough of this project and the people who have been involved in it. Becky, Richard, Scott, Joey, Mike and Sarah, and anybody else I haven't mentioned. I've worked so hard to make this project succeed, and it really has succeeded. Yeah? Because the Lost Peatlands project has helped us to understand and process all of these things. And that is perhaps the most important thing of all. Here's something to ponder. If we are not there, there is no landscape. Thank you.